We will make Britain a country that works not for a privileged few, but for every one of us. That will be the mission of the government I lead, and together we will build a better Britain.
Britain's new Prime Minister, Theresa May, is in Number 10 tonight, assembling her government and promising to fight for ordinary working people. Mrs May had accepted an invitation from Her Majesty the Queen to form a new government after the resignation of David Cameron. She then came to Downing Street with her husband Philip and made an immediate start on a far-reaching cabinet reshuffle. Boris Johnson is the new Foreign Secretary, Philip Hammond is the new Chancellor, Amber Rudd goes to the Home Office, and David Davis takes charge of negotiations to leave the European Union. Earlier, David Cameron had left Number 10 for the last time as Prime Minister, accompanied by his wife and children.
You can achieve a lot of things in politics. You can get a lot of things done. And that, in the end, the public service, the national interest, that is what it's all about. Nothing is really impossible if you put your mind to it. After all, as I once said, I was the future once.
And in the Commons, a standing ovation from his own side in a farewell appearance that combined some humour with a note of regret.
Here, MPs join commuters in calling Southern Rail a disgrace and ask the government to strip the operator of its franchise. And the theatre at the heart of Southampton's bid to become City of Culture.
Very good evening from Downing Street, where Britain's new Prime Minister, Theresa May, is assembling her new government tonight. She took over from David Cameron, who tendered his resignation to the Queen after 6 years in office. The transfer of power was swift. Mr Cameron, flanked by his wife and children, stood here outside Number 10 and said he believed he was leaving the country much stronger. Mrs May was then invited by the Queen to form a new government, and in her statement outside Number 10, she promised to fight injustice and respond to the needs of working families. Tonight we'll be reporting on Mrs May's first cabinet appointments, including Boris Johnson as Foreign Secretary, her political agenda and the reaction around the UK and beyond. But first, our political editor Laura Kunsberg reports on the day a new Prime Minister took charge in Downing Street.
Number 10 Downing Street, SW1, is only a smart address. But it's the home of the most powerful politician in the land. The woman who tonight is in charge of running our country. Well recognised, yes, but not yet widely known or understood. In this most formal of ways, to the country, this was her way of saying hello.
Her Majesty the Queen has asked me to form a new government, and I accepted. In David Cameron, I follow in the footsteps of a great modern Prime Minister. But David's true legacy is not about the economy, but about social justice. From the introduction of same-sex marriage to taking people on low wages out of income tax altogether, David Cameron has led a one-nation government, and it is in that spirit that I also plan to lead. Because not everybody knows this, but the full title of my party is the Conservative and Unionist Party. And that word unionist is very important to me. It means we believe in the Union, the precious, precious bond between England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. But it means something else that is just as important. It means we believe in a union not just between the nations of the United Kingdom, but between all of our citizens, every one of us, whoever we are and wherever we're from.
And for the new Tory Prime Minister, conscious she was not chosen in a general election, a direct promise. She will try to govern for all.
If you're from an ordinary working-class family, life is much harder than many people in Westminster realise. You have a job, but you don't always have job security. You have your own home, but you worry about paying the mortgage. You can just about manage, but you worry about the cost of living and getting your kids into a good school. If you're one of those families, if you're just managing, I want to address you directly. I know you're working around the clock. I know you're doing your best, and I know that sometimes life can be a struggle. The government I lead will be driven not by the interests of the privileged few, but by yours. We will do everything we can to give you more control over your lives. We are living through an important moment in our country's history. Following the referendum, we face a time of great national change. And I know, because we're Great Britain, that we will rise to the challenge. As we leave the European Union, we will forge a bold, new, positive role for ourselves in the world. And we will make Britain a country that works not for a privileged few, but for every one of us. That will be the mission of the government I lead, and together we will build a better Britain.
Walking through the portals of a new era, applauded traditionally by the Downing Street staff, immediately, as she always says, to get on with the job. This day, though, began with a show of support for the man who was moving out, even after all the rancour, humour and some affection in the Commons, Westminster's beating heart. Normally a raucous bear pit.
Questions to the Prime Minister.
It was Prime Minister's comedy stand-up rather than Prime Minister's questions.
Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. Other than one meeting this afternoon with Her Majesty the Queen, the diary for the rest of my day is remarkably light.
MPs from nearly all sides offering good humour.
I'm told that there are lots of leadership roles out there at the moment. There's the England football team. There's Top Gear.
And a joke from the opposition leader at David Cameron's expense.
Talking of the economy, the Home Secretary again, she said, many people find themselves exploited by unscrupulous bosses. I can't imagine who she's referring to.
Then the last of David Cameron at the dispatch box.
I will miss the roar of the crowd. I will miss the barbs from the opposition. But I will be willing you on. And I mean willing all of you on, because people come here with huge passion for the issues they care about. They come here with great love for the constituencies that they represent. The last thing I'd say is that you can achieve a lot of things in politics. You can get a lot of things done. And that, in the end, the public service, the national interest, that is what it's all about. Nothing is really impossible if you put your mind to it. After all, as I once said, I was the future once.
An ovation from the Tory benches. A wave to his family watching on. At Downing Street, they waited.
It's almost over now. The PMPs are just finishing, so it could be soon.
For him to give the formal goodbye. His job at the Commons, just to wave farewell, gathering up the family leaving their way of life too. Samantha Cameron alongside the departing PM. A rare glimpse with their 3 children, part of the grandest leaving do in town. Cheered out, but leaving a country divided over the European Union out before he intended to go, and his party divided too. But then back to number 10 for the Cameron family's Kodak moment. He was the future once, always a politician ready with a line. But this afternoon, with the power of goodbye, he didn't really need a script.
It's not been an easy journey, and of course we've not got every decision right. But I do believe that today our country is much stronger. Above all, it was about turning around the economy. And with the deficit cut by 2/3, 2.5 million more people in work, and 1 million more businesses, there can be no doubt that our economy is immeasurably stronger.
David Cameron wanted a different Tory party and a different country. But he leaves the same way they all do. So many fights forgotten, failure remembered, among some success. But the family remains.
I want to thank my children, Nancy, Elwyn and Florence, for whom Downing Street has been a lovely home over these last 6 years. They sometimes kick the red boxes full of work. Florence, you once climbed into one before a foreign trip and said, "Take me with you." Well, no more boxes. And above all, I want to thank Samantha, the love of my life. You have kept me vaguely sane. It has been the greatest honour of my life to serve our country as Prime Minister over these last 6 years, and to serve as leader of my party for almost 11 years. And as we leave for the last time, my only wish is continued success for this great country that I love so very much. Thank you.
Then, almost time to go. But first, a family hug on the steps of number 10. No more of these for him. It was for the new Prime Minister to have her first audience at the Palace, the Queen's 13th Prime Minister. Broad smiles on both sides as they met. And with that done, Theresa May safely installed, the calls to colleagues began. With the referendum result ringing in the ear, Eurosceptic faces, David Davis to negotiate our relationship with the EU, Liam Fox to drum up international trade. But look, the biggest jobs. Philip Hammond at the Treasury, a safe pair of hands straight to the office tonight.
Good evening.
Amber Rudd to the Home Department, also getting down to business. And the biggest shock for the Tories' biggest star, perhaps, Boris Johnson, in charge of our relations with the world at the Foreign Office.
That was the trip.
Listen, he can hardly believe it either. A leader whose trademark is caution, but has already surprised. Events, as they always do, will no doubt surprise her. But weeks from the country's biggest political decision for decades, not much is certain. Sometimes politicians find a moment. Sometimes the moment finds them. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, Theresa May wasted no time in sacking George Osborne as Chancellor and then in appointing Boris Johnson, the former Mayor of London and the prominent Leave campaigner, as we've seen, to one of the biggest jobs in government, that of Foreign Secretary. Mr Johnson, who abandoned his own challenge for the party leadership, will not be responsible for managing the process of Britain's exit from the EU. That job goes to the veteran Conservative MP David Davis. Our correspondent Ben Wright reports now on Boris Johnson's emergence as one of the biggest names in this new government.
Meet the man who will represent Britain abroad. After weeks of political surprises, this was yet another jaw-dropping shock. Boris Johnson has been sent to the Foreign Office. He played a leading role in campaigning for Britain to quit the EU, pulling in the crowds, one of the rare politicians who can.
Friends, now this is a once-in-a-lifetime chance.
But victory immediately turned him into a figure of hate to some. And his hopes a Leave win would sweep him into number 10 crumbled when the man who had been by his side through the weeks of campaigning destroyed Boris Johnson's dreams of becoming Prime Minister.
But during the course of the last few days, I've realised that while Boris does have those very special abilities to communicate and to reach out, what he did not have was the capacity to build and to lead that team and to provide the leadership the country needs at this critical moment.
Boris Johnson had no option but to pull out of the race.
That having consulted colleagues and in view of the circumstances in Parliament, I have concluded that person cannot be me.
Even Theresa May had a pop at Boris Johnson's negotiating skills when she launched her campaign.
Last time he did a deal with the Germans, he came back with 3 nearly new water cannon.
Water cannon she, as Home Secretary, refused to let him use.
Nice to see you. Thank you very much.
But people who know Boris Johnson insist he is ready for one of the government's top jobs.
This is a man who had a huge personal mandate as Mayor of London. He was a fantastic statesman for London. He managed to put London on the world stage when he was Mayor. He speaks several languages, he's extremely charismatic, and I actually think he's really ready for this job.
Boris Johnson hogs the political limelight, and his role as London Mayor gave him a big job and a big stage.
That is a big fish.
But it wasn't without controversy. Last year, he had to cut short a trip to the Palestinian territories after making remarks judged by his hosts to be offensive and too pro-Israel.
Oh, look at the size of that airport. It's amazing, isn't it?
Mr Johnson has clocked up the air miles on trade trips, pulling in business for London. And his hunger to win has always been clear, even against school children in Japan. Beyond Britain, they might not know much about Boris Johnson beyond his knack for scrapes, japes and a fruity turn of phrase. But the man who took the biggest political gamble of his life by campaigning against David Cameron is now Britain's top diplomat, and the world will find out who he is. Ben Wright, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, a short while ago, Boris Johnson left the Foreign Office and made his way home, gave his first considered response to the challenge that he's taken on as Foreign Secretary, and this is what he had to say.
Yeah, obviously very humble, very proud to be offered this chance. I think Theresa made a wonderful speech this afternoon about her ambitions for the country and how she saw the Conservative government taking Britain forward. I completely agree with her sentiments and about opportunity, about giving people better life chances. And clearly now we have a massive opportunity in this country to make a great success of our new relationship with Europe and with the world, and I'm very excited to be asked to play a part in that.
The new Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, speaking just a few minutes ago. Laura Kuensberg with me, our political editor. Lots for us to talk about during the course of this programme, Laura. Let's start with the shape of this new government and indeed the new Foreign Secretary.
Well, indeed, I think even Boris Johnson himself looked pretty surprised by the fact Theresa May's asked him to be the Foreign Secretary tonight. This is a big gesture to one of the leading Eurosceptics in the referendum campaign. The person who was on that side of the argument with the biggest public profile, probably the biggest public popularity and probably also notoriety. It's a message to people who voted to leave to say, look, I get it. I'm putting people in charge of our relationships with the rest of the world who understood that case. He's joined in that with Liam Fox, who'll head up a new department for international trade, and also David Davis, who's the former Shadow Home Secretary, an ardent Eurosceptic and often critic of Theresa May, in fact. He will head up the new department for Brexit, whatever it ends up being called. And I think with those three appointments, Theresa May is really trying to show that she takes the reality of us leaving the European Union very seriously. She expects the three of them to work together to get on with it. But you know, the other surprise tonight is the fact that she told George Osborne, the Chancellor in number 11 for 6 years, that his services were no longer required. I think that shows us that she is very determined to draw a line above a line between her administration and David Cameron's administration. She is shaping this in her own image. She is calling the shots. Yes, she wants there to be stability. Yes, she wants there to be continuity, but that does not mean that she's in any way afraid to make her own decisions. But you know, some of our viewers might be thinking, hang on, a few hours ago she stood out here and talked about the fact that she wants to govern for everyone, and here she's appointing a couple of people from the right wing of the Tory party to her top table. But it's clear from speaking to her team tonight that will not define her agenda at home, and with other appointments like health and education still to come, I think we'll see more of that message for the centre ground, her hope to govern for everyone in the next appointments that they'll follow up with tomorrow morning.
We'll explore a little more later. Thanks very much, Laura, from Laura Kuensberg there. Well, earlier this evening, Mrs May spoke in some detail about what she wanted to achieve as Prime Minister. She's already said that there'll be no backing down over exiting the European Union. She's also committed to building a fairer economy with a narrower pay gap between bosses and workers, and a government at the service of ordinary working people, in her words. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, John Pienaar, on Theresa May's mission as Prime Minister.
She'll remember this moment when things get tough, and they will, starting now. Theresa May was only embraced as Tory leader on Monday. Now she's on a journey as tough as any leader in peacetime. There've been markers. Remember her telling Tories people just didn't like them anymore.
You know what some people call us? The nasty party.
Theresa May, are your lines on migration just rhetoric?
And the time she came down against uncontrolled migration.
There is no case in the national interest for immigration of the scale we have experienced over the last decade.
The next Prime Minister of this great country, Theresa May.
May's Britain somehow would have to be tough and tender. Just moments before she knew for sure she'd be PM, Theresa May mapped out her global ambition.
To steer us through this time of economic and political uncertainty, and to negotiate the best deal for Britain as we leave the EU, and forge a new role for ourselves in the world.
Remaking relations between Britain and the world, that's a huge task. In talks in Brussels, somehow curbing EU migration and getting a deal on trade. Dozens of deals need doing worldwide, and top EU out-campaigners will play a lead role in that, and guarding Britain's global influence in NATO at the UN.
We've got to be very clear that our decision to leave the European Union doesn't mean Britain's going to become an inward-focused nation. We're going to carry on playing the role we normally play on the international stage, in NATO, in the United Nations, in our security relationships with other countries. There will be a big focus under Theresa May in making sure that we very much stay part of the international community. Our decision on the European Union is a political one within Europe. It's not about Britain becoming a small nation focused on itself.
When it comes to the Brexit economy, business and public finances outside the EU, the task's just as tall. The Prime Minister wants British business more competitive, more productive. That needs help from government. Under Mrs May, foreign takeovers of firms vital to Britain could be blocked. George Osborne wanted more productive business, now it's more urgent. And to get more homes built, they're needed badly. As for public spending, he tried to cut welfare and failed. Rebel Tory MPs can block any policy, easily, but public money is still scarce. Philip Hammond's in-tray looks loaded.
We've got to build on the strong economic legacy that Theresa May's inheriting. We've got to continue to make sure that we manage the public finances wisely and that we encourage business to take advantage of the challenges, but also the opportunities that Brexit throws up.
You make it sound simple.
It's a tough challenge, but she's the right woman to do it, and she's obviously got the negotiating skills to make sure that Brexit is a win-win for the world.
But the ambition for greater fairness at home in Britain, less privilege, more equality, that's as big as any. Since her early days as a shadow minister, Theresa May's job's been about policy supporting women. Now it's about more.
A society that works for everyone. So we bring people back together. Rich and poor, north and south, urban and rural, young and old, male and female, black and white, sick and healthy, public sector, private sector, those with skills and those without.
That sounded like David Cameron's vision for fairness and equal opportunity and more. The aim is to cool the resentment and deep division between haves and have-nots. Today, a minister told me it's a mission which will take time, perhaps a lot of time. How much of this mission of making Britain a fairer place in every way can you realistically expect her to manage?
Well, I think she's started that journey already, and with David and that there. And you're not going to do it in one parliament. You're not going to probably do it. It's probably something you have to keep doing, keep embedding in. But as I said to you yesterday,
it's a mission of decades.
Well, of course it is, but it's not a reason not to do it. And I think all too often it's been in the too difficult pile.
Britain's new Prime Minister won't lack for goodwill from her party, but the political honeymoon won't last long. It never does. And then the truly hard work begins. The awkward international negotiations, pushing through ambitious plans and reforms with a tiny majority in the Commons. None of it's easy in normal times, and these times are anything but normal. If Theresa May wants to know how hard it can be to be Prime Minister, she knows exactly who to ask. John Pienaar, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, in his final statement as Prime Minister, David Cameron sought to define his legacy after 6 years in government and 11 years as Conservative leader, winning a Conservative majority at last year's general election against all the odds. His time in office, as we know, was dominated by economic challenges, the struggle to balance the government's books. But his premiership did come to that abrupt end when his recommendation to stay in the EU was rejected by the British voters. The BBC's Nick Robinson, who reported on Mr Cameron's time as party leader and Prime Minister, considers his legacy.
It began where it ended, on the doorstep of number 10. It began with success which few expected, and ended in failure which few foresaw. David Cameron became our youngest Prime Minister for 200 years, not because he won an election, but because he won over Nick Clegg to the idea of a coalition.
Prime Minister, do you now regret when, once asked what your favourite joke was, you replied, Nick Clegg?
We're all going to have. I'm afraid I did once.
The joke was on those who said the coalition could never last. Love it or loathe it, theirs would be a stable government, unlike most in Europe, after the worst economic crisis in decades.
Solidarity forever.
The cuts they said they had to make in what was called the age of austerity were far from popular, and yet most seemed to accept them. This afternoon, the man who was Mr Cameron's Director of Communications spoke to me in a quiet, now empty office in number 10.
There was a dinner at Downing Street last night where David Cameron had a few family and friends round, and somebody paying tribute to him there said that he was a quiet revolutionary, and I think that's really apt. He started by forming a coalition government, and that really was a revolutionary thing to do. It hadn't happened for 70 years, and he showed the vision and determination to do it because it gave economic stability to the country at a time when it was in crisis.
Many Tories didn't much like the coalition, and they liked this even less. A Conservative Prime Minister siding with gay campaigners and against those who insisted marriage should only be between a man and a woman. And his decision to increase spending on overseas aid while cutting it at home was scarcely more popular, with the growing number tempted to back UKIP, a party that was winning more and more support, even though he'd once dismissed them as a home for fruitcakes and loonies.
I tell you what, I've been up half the night. This is absolutely marvellous.
Under growing pressure from within and without, David Cameron made this fateful promise.
We will give the British people a referendum with a very simple in or out choice: to stay in the European Union on these new terms or to come out altogether.
It was a massive gamble that EU leaders would give him a better deal and that British voters would back it. A gamble that was to go spectacularly wrong.
This issue of whether or not Britain remained or left the EU was a slow train coming. It just happened to arrive in the station on his watch. It was inevitable that there was going to be a referendum. He showed real leadership, guts and determination in calling it. It didn't work out for him, but there was real leadership there.
Some said a referendum was simply too risky, but David Cameron agreed to another on Scottish independence. And though it looked mighty close at times, he won it, thanks to what Yes campaigners complained was Project Fear.
Please welcome the Prime Minister.
His next big electoral test was last year's general election. He warned that electing Ed Miliband would produce instability and chaos. But I suggested to him that that's precisely what would result from his EU promise.
And if you don't win the referendum, what's Plan B for Britain?
Well, I'm confident we will get the deal.
What's Plan
I've
B?
demonstrated. Well, Plan B is to hold a referendum and for
Plan
the British
B is you
people
don't
to
know.
choose. No, I do know.
You may have a negotiation you can't succeed in and a vote that you lose, and Britain will be out of the EU.
It was, though, a popular, perhaps an election-winning promise.
We are saying the Conservatives are the largest party.
But just 13 months later, another electoral surprise. The unthinkable happened.
And the answer is, we're out.
There was no Plan B. David Cameron had led us out of the EU by mistake.
In the end, his legacy will be having ripped up Britain's relationships with our nearest neighbours and also left a country that is very divided, and that wasn't what he wanted to do.
That is why the Cameron family were forced to leave number 10 today, 2 years earlier than they'd originally planned.
In a few days' time, David Cameron will take his place on the wall here at number 10 alongside other former Prime Ministers. When he got the job, he told me that what mattered was character, the ability to take a decision. He left office today because of one decision that went terribly wrong. Nick Robinson, BBC News, 10 Downing Street.
So let's pick up again on the attempt by Mr Cameron today to define his own legacy as he was leaving Downing Street. Laura, your thoughts on that?
Well, I think, as the arriving Prime Minister was seeking to appear calm, polished, in control with the departing Prime Minister, we saw a more human side, surrounded by his family, obviously emotional, not surprisingly. But despite that, he leaves a party and a country changed. That's pretty clear. Things have changed just because of the passage of time, but also as a consequence of the decisions that he made in his time in office. There's a smaller state, Most profoundly, of course, we're on our way out of the European Union. There have been big changes to the economy. Some, but not all of the deficit has been paid off. But what he wanted to highlight are the things that perhaps he was going to try to do more of in his second term. Those social reforms, the thing that in the last year he's been telling us he really cared about. So today he was highlighting equal marriage. He was highlighting the fact that 2/3 of the deficit has been paid off. He was talking too about people who've set up their own businesses, people having more control over their own lives. But I think, you know, on the drama of a day like this, our attention moves at lightning speed to the person who's just walked through the door. But there's no question, as David Cameron left, he leaves a country that's changed for good.
We'll talk a little later, Laura, about the challenges now facing the new Prime Minister, but for now, thanks very much, Laura Kingsburg there. Quick reminder, you can get the very latest on our website, BBC News Online, including analysis of Mrs May's new cabinet appointments, all the latest appointments there for you with background on the new jobs and the new ministers who've been appointed today, bbc.co.uk/news. Well, to talk about those challenges, managing Britain's exit from the European Union will of course be a major priority for Mrs May. As we've heard, she's appointed the senior Conservative MP David Davis to take charge of that process. Some of those European leaders who will be involved in the talks have been giving their views on the way ahead, and one said that despite what he called the divorce, the UK and the European Union would be the closest partners. Our Europe editor Katja Adler reports now on the view from the European Union.
For the rest of Europe, the significance of Theresa May becoming UK Prime Minister is this. She will be the figurehead leading Britain's exit from the European Union. And she'll need to negotiate the details with all of these EU leaders. In an awkward situation, maintaining cordial relations will be key. Today, on an official visit to China, the EU tone sounded positive.
I will not negotiate with Britain in a hostile mood. We are partners. I'm not giving public advices to the incoming British Prime Minister. I don't want to lecture her. I don't want to talk about her before having talked with her.
It's here in Brussels that Theresa May will meet all EU leaders for the very first time at a summit in a couple of months. And she'll be anxious to grab that opportunity to talk to them off the record, perhaps over a cup of coffee, about the kind of deal the UK can expect outside the EU. But she'll have her work cut out for her because some of those leaders don't want to talk a word about Brexit until the formal process of the UK leaving has started. It's going to be quite some juggling act. France is feeling vengeful. It wants tough negotiations to put others, especially Eurosceptic French voters, off pushing to leave the EU. Italy wants to send a strong message too. With its own economic and political problems, it needs the EU to stick together. While Eastern and Baltic Europe don't want to alienate Britain. They need UK backing to keep a hard line against Russia. But this arguably is Theresa May's most important negotiating partner when it comes to Brexit. Germany's powerful Angela Merkel. Like Theresa May, steely, wily, determined. Some suggest as women they're more likely to reach an understanding. But with practiced politicians like these, the only factor important to them is getting what they want. Of course, Theresa May is no stranger to Brussels. She's been here many times for EU ministers' meetings. But officials here warn that she, never mind her newly appointed Secretary for Brexit, the anti-EU David Davis, shouldn't underestimate them.
I think Theresa May is well known. She will find people who know her, who will negotiate on equal footing with her, but I repeat, on equal footing.
Even for someone with a reputation as a tough negotiator like Mrs May.
Theresa May is a tough negotiator, I can assure you. Here in the European Parliament are tough negotiators as well.
The EU-UK relationship has never been easy. Theresa May now represents a Britain that has voted to leave. She'll find safeguarding UK interests here even more complex, in the short term at least. Well, I have here a copy of a letter sent to Theresa May this evening by the President of the European Commission. In it, as you'd expect, he congratulates her on her new job, but he also insists that she clarifies as soon as possible what he calls the new situation between the UK and the EU following the Brexit vote. These are polite words that just about cover huge frustration felt by him and other EU leaders that the UK is apparently under no immediate hurry to start formal negotiations to leave the EU. Just tonight, the French president called the new British Prime Minister and said those formal talks have to start ASAP. But that is not an opinion shared by her new Secretary for Brexit. And his appointment and that of Boris Johnson, the leading Brexiteer, as new Foreign Secretary will set off alarm bells here in Brussels. Jean-Claude Juncker accused Mr Johnson of telling untruths to British voters before the referendum, and he's likely to receive a very tepid welcome here in Brussels if he comes to a planned meeting of foreign ministers here on Monday.
Katya, once again, thanks very much. Katya Adler there, our Europe editor, with the latest in Brussels. Now, one of the most prominent messages delivered by the new Prime Minister was her commitment to the Union, the United Kingdom of England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. But the result of the referendum in Scotland and Northern Ireland, where a majority of people voted to remain, has prompted some very direct questions for Theresa May. Let's get the views now of three of my colleagues, and we start with our Scotland editor, Sarah Smith, who's in Edinburgh.
Hugh, as you said, Theresa May began her premiership with a very clear message to Scotland and to Scottish voters. Practically, her first words as Prime Minister were about how she valued the Union, the precious, precious bond, she called it, between Scotland, England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And she knows possibly one of the biggest challenges of her period as Prime Minister may be trying to preserve the union between Scotland and the rest of the UK. The SNP leader Nicola Sturgeon has said she thinks it is highly likely there will be a second referendum on Scottish independence since Scotland voted to stay in the EU and now faces, in her words, being dragged out against its will. Ms Sturgeon was saying today that she is demanding that the Scottish Government be fully involved in the Brexit negotiations, and she thinks it's her job to try and preserve Scotland's place within the EU somehow. And if she can't do that, then she repeated again today, the option of Scottish independence is still very much on the table. So one of the bigger decisions possibly that Theresa May might face as Prime Minister is whether or not to allow another vote, another referendum that could lead to Scotland leaving the UK.
Memorably, David Cameron described the border between England and Wales as a line between life and death in the NHS. That soured the relationship with the Welsh Labour government here in Cardiff. Theresa May starts, well, with a clean slate. The First Minister here today saying he'd had to turn to the internet to find any quotes from her pertaining to Wales. But now she will have to become very deeply involved and work with the Labour administration. The first thing on the list for them to tackle, the ongoing steel crisis. If it's been a difficult few weeks for the politicians, difficult months for steel workers here in Wales and elsewhere, the ongoing uncertainty over what Tata will do with its plants here. Just last week, them putting the sales process on hold. There now need to be answers from the UK government over what will happen to the pension pot. Then, of course, dealing with Brexit. A majority of people here in Wales voted for it, having been told by Leave campaigners, well, all the EU funding that comes here will be replaced by money from central government. That wasn't a promise that Mrs May made. Will it be a promise, however, she feels she has to keep? Thirdly, then, the future of this place. There is already a bill going through Parliament giving the National Assembly greater powers on things like energy projects, speed limits, the voting age. But will all that be overtaken by events in Scotland and elsewhere? Theresa May will have to make herself a familiar figure here in Cardiff Bay. Certainly her inbox is filling up fast.
Well, here in Northern Ireland, there's been a divided response to Theresa May becoming Prime Minister. Unionists have welcomed it. In her, they see a traditional Tory who shares many of their values. And of course, she made the point today of calling herself the leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party. Nationalists, on the other hand, have had something of a cooler response. Sinn Féin, in fact, saying that Theresa May could be bad for Northern Ireland, could be bad for the peace process. And some of those concerns going forward will be about the implications of Brexit. Certainly there are people who fear that Northern Ireland's economy could be particularly exposed once the UK leaves the EU. And part of that is about the cross-border trade with the Republic of Ireland, which will remain an EU country. And of course that will mean that that is also a border between the UK and the EU, where the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland meets. Now, whenever the referendum campaign was ongoing, Theresa May was here as Home Secretary, and she made clear that she believed the border would have to change, that there would have to be some kind of controls, that the open roads could not remain completely open. As Prime Minister, she might well feel very differently, and certainly she's not going to unsettle the years of progress that there have been. Tonight, the Irish Prime Minister, the Taoiseach Enda Kenny, has spoken to Theresa May, and he says that they will work together to ensure that Anglo-Irish relationships remain strong.
Chris, thanks very much. Chris Buckler there for us in Belfast, and Howell Griffith in Cardiff. Sarah Smith, our Scotland editor in Edinburgh. Thank you all very much. Well, people across the UK will be reflecting tonight on what lies ahead for this new Prime Minister, whether she'll be able to deliver on her pledges for a fairer economy, changes to immigration and the best possible deal for Britain to leave the European Union. Our home editor Mark Easton has been sampling people's views on Mrs May's toughest challenge, which is that of the terms of leaving the EU.
As the new Prime Minister prepares to defend Britain's interests in a new relationship with our European neighbours, she's repeatedly stated that Brexit means Brexit. But what does Brexit mean? Britain has decided to exit the European Union. But does the country also want to leave the EU single market? That's the question that will dominate the first years of Theresa May's premiership, because special access to the huge EU trading zone just across the Channel means accepting rules on free movement. There's a trade-off between the economy and immigration. The BBC has conducted an exclusive poll asking what should be the government priority: maintaining access to the single market or restricting freedom of movement so EU immigration is reduced. 2/3 of the representative sample surveyed said the single market, and 1/3 said immigration. While those who voted to remain in last month's referendum appear overwhelmingly in favour of prioritising the single market, Leave voters are much more divided. Here in Eastleigh in Hampshire, where the referendum result mirrors the national picture, there's a clear split on what Theresa May's priority should be.
I think immigration is the main thing. People voted to leave the European Union so that we could cut there's uncontrolled immigration at the moment, and that's a bad thing for the economy. It pushes wages down for the working people. So if that means that we have to forego access to the single market, then so be it.
I think immigrants should be encouraged. They all want to work, and I would say there's probably room for them.
I like getting along with my fellow man, and I think we've got to trade, and I think we've got to accept that immigration is part of what we're about.
So that's what voters think ought to happen, but what do they expect to happen? Our survey finds very low levels of trust in politicians to deliver the will of the people on Brexit. So what do voters think is the most likely outcome?
We offered three options. Stay in the single market with continued free movement. 18% said they thought that was most likely. Leave the single market and stop free movement. 26% expected that. Stay in the single market with some limits on free movement. A majority of leavers and remainers thought that kind of compromise is where the UK will end up. Theresa May has so far refused to say whether EU migrants who've recently arrived in the UK will be required to leave, a negotiating position that's left around 1 million foreign nationals feeling unsure about their future.
Sometimes I feel like, I don't like to use my own language, for example, or because, other people are around. So it's...
Slightly nervous times?
A little bit, yeah.
Our survey found that over 90% of people, whether they'd voted to leave or remain, thought most migrants would be allowed to stay. And some interesting findings on immigration too.
Just 13% expect immigration to fall a lot as a result of Brexit. And even among those who voted to leave, our survey suggests only around 1 in 5 expects immigration to fall sharply.
I think it'll go up again.
You think it'll go up? Really?
Yeah.
Despite everything?
Despite everything, yeah.
If Britain needs immigration, then Britain will have immigration. But if Britain doesn't, we're back in control.
Brexit means Brexit, but the newest word in the dictionary has yet to be properly defined. That, it seems, is among the first and most critical jobs for Britain's new Prime Minister. Mark Easton, BBC News, Eastleigh.
So let's remember tonight it's taken just 3 days for the Conservatives to replace David Cameron after that leadership race came to that abrupt end on Monday. But on the opposition benches in the House of Commons, Labour's leadership turmoil has continued. The contest is only just getting underway, with another challenger emerging today, as Jeremy Corbyn supporters expressed total confidence in his survival. Our political correspondent Alex Forsyth has the story.
Labour's leader seemed relaxed, arriving at a union conference in Brighton today. Here, his support's clear. But with two opponents wanting his job, talk of Labour splitting and claims of abuse on all sides, he's under pressure, yet defiant.
I've been elected the leader of this party, and I'm very proud of that position. And whenever the election comes, whenever it comes, we're going to be there, united, campaigning together.
But this man thinks he'll be a better leader, less divisive. The latest challenger, Owen Smith, positioning himself on Labour's left.
I agree with Jeremy Corbyn on anti-austerity, but we've got to have the policies in place, and Jeremy has not put in place a policy platform. The rhetoric's been great, but the delivery has been lacking, and crucially, he is leading a divided party.
So now there are two Labour MPs fighting for their leader's job, and today Angela Eagle claimed she's the unity candidate amid the turmoil.
This is about uniting our party so we can give strong leadership.
The challengers to Jeremy Corbyn know he won last time because he had overwhelming support from party members. Many MPs here may have lost faith in his leadership, but he'll be on the ballot paper without their backing, and it's the wider party which will choose its next leader. Although this time, the rules are different. Last year, thousands of people paid £3 to temporarily sign up to Labour and vote in the leadership election, most backing Jeremy Corbyn. They won't automatically get a say this time round. They'll have to sign up again as registered supporters and pay £25. And they only have a small window to do so between the 18th and 20th of July. Full party members will get a vote, but only if they joined Labour on or before January the 12th this year, excluding thousands who've joined since the referendum. At this rally of Jeremy Corbyn supporters tonight, there was anger at the change.
Nearly 20% of the membership have joined in the past couple of weeks since the EU referendum, and deliberately excluding them is incredibly unfair.
It's obvious what's happening here. It's a right-wing coup, and they're trying to silence us.
Despite pleas for calm, there's a febrile mood around this contest, with claims of abuse and threats, including from those who met here last night to set the rules.
The difficulty was that a number of us and a number of my colleagues in that room had been subject to bullying and intimidation prior to the meeting taking place.
The Shadow Chancellor's been accused of stoking tension with these comments about Jeremy Corbyn's rivals.
As plotters, useless.
He said it was a joke and condemned abusive behaviour.
There's fingers being pointed at all different directions. Wherever this is coming from, I don't think it's from within the party at all, wherever this is coming from, we've got to unite together across parties to say this isn't the sort of politics we want in this country.
But this three-way leadership fight is so far so brutal, some local party meetings have been suspended, perhaps because it's not just their fortunes at stake, but the Labour Party's future. Alex Forsyth, BBC News, Westminster.
I told her she could.
So back here in Downing Street tonight, let's reflect on the fact that a new Prime Minister who's inside number 10, Theresa May, at the age of 59, is the second woman to become British Prime Minister. It's been a remarkable rise for the clergyman's daughter from Eastbourne. Some of those who worked for her and with her say that she's quite a plain speaker. She's a demanding boss. She has a sharp eye for detail. She's among the toughest figures, her friends say, in politics. Here's Rita Chakrabarti now on Theresa May, the person.
Theresa Mary Brazier, as she was then, has travelled far, but from her early years as a schoolgirl to her role at the heart of government, she's remained for many something of an enigma. An old friend from her days at Oxford University recalls a more relaxed character, but who even then was combative.
She was a great pal. She was always reliable. I would trust her with anything. And I have learnt over the years, you never have an argument with her unless you're on very firm ground.
Theresa May was elected to Parliament in 1997 and quickly became known in her constituency as a conscientious and diligent local MP. Her political reputation as a steely negotiator rings very true to people who know her here.
I think Theresa's negotiating powers are extremely good, and I've dealt with her over the course of the last 10 years, so I know that how she can strike a hard bargain when she knows what she wants, when she's done the analysis, and she will stick to her guns.
She rose quickly, becoming Tory party chairman in 2002 under Ian Duncan Smith, charged with helping to modernise the Conservatives. The woman who's become Britain's second female Prime Minister has in the past declared that gender should be no obstacle to success.
But Margaret Thatcher proved that your ability to lead your country depends on your talent and your courage, not on whether you're a man or a woman.
But she's also recognised the barriers and actively campaigned for equality within the Tory party. A clear-thinking, straightforward politician, impatient of political frivolity.
She doesn't do gossip. I mean, if I had, over the many meetings I've had with her, the lunches, the discussions we've had, they've been entirely professional. I think if we'd started going down the, who's in, who's out, the Westminster chat, I'd have got a very hard stare, and possibly that bloody difficult woman would have told me that it's not an appropriate subject for discussion.
Married for 36 years, her husband Philip is known as her rock. He will now become only the second male partner to inhabit number 10. Philip May won't have to undergo the sort of scrutiny that a female spouse has to, except in tongue-in-cheek articles like this one. But that's not the only way in which the tone and mood in Downing Street are likely to change. Theresa May is likely to bring a serious edge to being PM. Events have moved quickly, but this formidable politician may 10 years ago have had an inkling of what was to come.
So have faith. Anything is possible if you work hard enough to achieve it.
Rita Chakrabarti, BBC News.
Well, before we have a final word with Laura, let's have a look at how some of tomorrow morning's papers are going to be handling today's momentous events. There's the Daily Telegraph looking at May bringing in the Brexiteers, talking there, of course, about Boris Johnson and Liam Fox and David Davis. That's the Telegraph's take. The Guardian says May's pledge to Brexit Britain, the pledge that she's taking a very serious approach, putting David Davis in charge there of the process of negotiating those terms. That's not Boris Johnson's job, that's David Davis's job. And a look at the Daily Mirror. Let's look at the Mirror's front page there. It's that infamous image again, isn't it, really, from back from 2012. Dear world, sorry, is the Daily Mirror's take on Boris Johnson's appointment as Foreign Secretary today. So, as I say, Laura's with me again. Let's really just, at the end of this programme, Laura, just think about the immense scale of the challenge that Theresa May now faces.
Yes, Theresa May, whenever she's near a microphone, says she just wants to get on with the job. And tonight she's been doing that, making calls to leaders around the world, notably the first phone call to Angela Merkel, the German leader. But despite her want to just get on with things, she's really going to be held to account, like every Prime Minister in modern times, and on two big things. Firstly, keeping the promise she's made that we will leave the European Union, and Brexit means Brexit, as she describes it. But secondly, keeping that bold promise she made just there earlier today, that although she's not been chosen by the general public at an election, she will govern for everyone. That was a direct promise she made to the nation. And she is a very determined politician, but on both of those things there are big hurdles in her way. How do we go about the process of leaving the European Union? That's still not at all clear. How does she keep that second promise at a time when public spending budgets are still under real pressure? Spending is still being squeezed across the board. But so much has changed. in the last 3 weeks. It's sort of dizzying. But for Theresa May, there's one big challenge that David Cameron has that she will still has. This government only has a majority of 12, of just a dozen. That means that Theresa May is going to have to be absolutely sure of what she's doing, whether it's dealing with the country's existing problems or trying to bring in something new. Because fine words don't count for very much if you can't actually get anything done.
Indeed. Laura, thanks very much. We'll talk again tomorrow, I'm sure. Laura Kuenssberg there, our political editor here in Downing Street. That's all from BBC News at 10 on the day that Britain got a new Prime Minister, Theresa May, who replaced David Cameron and has committed to fighting injustice during her time in office, assembling a radically different team of ministers to try to deliver on those promises. Newsnight is underway on BBC Two. Next on BBC One is time for the news where you are, but we'll leave you with some of the powerful words and images of this remarkable day at Westminster. Have a good night.